Imagine for a moment that you could travel through time, not to imperial Rome, not to the Egypt of the pharaohs, but to something much older and more mysterious. Jerusalem, 4,000 years ago, an era so distant that we can barely understand how these people lived, thought, and died. What you're about to discover will shock you completely. Because life in this sacred city thousands of years before Christ was completely different from what you imagine. And the fate of these people, well, it's something that archaeologists have only recently discovered, and it's going to change everything you thought you knew about the history of humanity. Stay until the end, because I'm going to reveal secrets buried for millennia that will make you question everything you've learned about our ancestors. Secrets so troubling that some archaeologists have hesitated to make them public. But before diving into this fascinating journey, let me ask you a question. Have you ever stopped to think about what waking up one morning 4,000 years ago would be like? The smell in the air? The sounds around you? The concerns that would cross your mind? Prepare yourself, because you're about to experience this more realistically than you've ever imagined. We're talking about the period between 2000 and 1800 BC. To put this in perspective, this is an era before Moses, before Abraham, according to many historians, even before the first Egyptian dynasties that built the Great Pyramids. We're talking about an age lost in the mists of time. At that time, Jerusalem was not the sacred city we know today. There was no Temple of Solomon. There were no imposing walls. There wasn't even the name Jerusalem. It was only a small Canaanite settlement, known by the few historical documents as Jebus, inhabited by tribes that most people have never heard of. But here's the first shocking secret that will demolish everything you thought about this era. These people weren't primitive as we think. They weren't cavemen struggling for survival with clubs and animal skins. Recent archaeological excavations, particularly intensified over the last decade, have revealed evidence of an astonishingly sophisticated society, with knowledge that rivaled, and in some cases, exceeded that of much more famous civilizations of the time. They had complex irrigation systems that channeled rainwater through elaborate underground canals. They had advanced metallurgy that produced tools and weapons of a quality that wouldn't be seen again in the region for centuries. And perhaps most impressive of all, they possessed astronomical knowledge that allowed them to predict eclipses, seasonal changes, and even navigate through the desert using the stars. And now comes the question that won't be silenced. How do we know all this? How is it possible to reconstruct the lives of people who lived so long ago that their languages have disappeared, their cities have turned to dust, and their names have been forgotten by history? The answer will surprise you and, frankly, give you chills. In 2019, an international team of archaeologists, led by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, was conducting routine excavations in the city of David, the oldest part of Jerusalem, when something extraordinary happened. No, they didn't find gold, they didn't find ancient jewelry or lost treasures. They found something much more precious, and much more troubling, an intact 4,000-year-old cemetery, with hundreds of skeletons, perfectly preserved by the region's dry climate. But this wasn't just an ordinary cemetery, it was a complete, organized, stratified necropolis that told a detailed story about how these people lived, worked, loved, and died. Each skeleton was a library of information. Each tomb was a historical archive preserved by the earth itself. What these bones revealed was astounding. Through DNA analysis, isotopic studies, computerized tomography, and forensic techniques that would seem like science fiction to archaeologists from decades past, scientists managed to reconstruct not only how these people lived, but exactly what they ate for breakfast, where they were born, what type of work they did, what diseases they had, how many children they had fathered, and how they died. And the discoveries were so surprising that they completely changed our understanding of primitive urban life. These results were published in prestigious scientific journals like Nature and Science, causing a stir in the international archaeological community. And here begins our journey into the lives of these people forgotten by history, a journey that will literally transport you into their homes, their families, their fears, and their dreams. Wake up at 5 in the morning. There's no alarm clock. There's no electric light. There's no instant coffee waiting for you. There's only the sound of the first birds singing in the Kidron Valley, the dim glow of the horizon over the arid hills of Judea, and the smell of smoke rising from neighboring houses, where other families have already begun lighting their primitive stoves. You are an inhabitant of Jebus 4,000 years ago, and your life is about to begin another day that will be simultaneously familiar and completely foreign to our modern standards. Your house isn't a primitive straw hut like Hollywood wants you to believe. The excavations have shown that these residences were impressive constructions of local limestone, precisely cut and assembled with techniques that demonstrate advanced engineering knowledge. Many had up to 3 distinct rooms, a central area for cooking and socializing, a private bedroom for sleeping, and even a space dedicated to storing grains and tools. Even more impressive, they had sophisticated drainage systems, with channels carved into the rocky ground that carried wastewater away from living areas. Some archaeologists have found evidence of a primitive sort of central heating, using strategically positioned braziers and ventilation systems that distributed heat throughout the house during the cold nights of the Judean winter. But wait, it gets even better, and here's something that will really shock you. These ancestors had something that most people of this era didn't have anywhere in the world. They knew how to read and write. I'm not talking about primitive symbols or simple pictograms. I'm talking about a sophisticated writing system, a primitive form of Canaanite script that was discovered in hundreds of ceramic fragments, metal pieces, and even on house walls found in the excavations. This means that 4,000 years ago, while most of humanity still depended entirely on oral tradition, the inhabitants of Jebus were already maintaining written records, commercial contracts, inventory lists, and even what appear to be personal letters and love poems. Your first meal of the day would be surprisingly varied and nutritious. Bread made from a mixture of barley and wheat, naturally fermented and baked in communal ovens that heated entire neighborhoods. This bread was accompanied by fresh goat's milk, cheese aged in natural caves, sweet figs, harvested from trees that grew on terraces, built on the hillsides, and wild honey collected from hives they had learned to partially domesticate. Archaeologists discovered all this through a fascinating combination of techniques. Carbonized food remains found in ancient ovens were chemically analyzed to determine ingredients. Microscopic analysis of bacterial plaque on the skeleton's teeth revealed details about habitual diets. Even isotope analyses in the bones managed to determine the proportion of animal versus plant proteins in these ancient people's diets.
And here's a detail that will make you laugh. They had dental problems exactly like us. Cavities, gingivitis, tooth loss. The difference is that they developed their own primitive but effective solutions, including a rudimentary form of toothpaste made with aromatic herbs and mineral salt extracted from natural deposits in the Dead Sea region. But this is where the story becomes really interesting, and where the archaeological discoveries begin to paint a much more complex and frankly troubling picture of ancient Jebus society. These people weren't just simple farmers struggling to survive in a hostile world. Meticulous analysis of the tombs revealed a highly stratified society with at least 3, possibly 4 distinct social classes, each with its own burial rituals, personal objects, and even specific diets. The rulers, identified through elaborate tombs carved into solid rock and lined with carefully selected stones, were buried with a wealth of objects that tells a fascinating story of international connections. Bronze objects imported from what is now Turkey, glass beads from Mesopotamia, incense from the mountains of present-day Lebanon, and even fabric fragments that chemical analyses showed had been dyed with purple extracted from Mediterranean sea mollusks. This means that 4,000 years ago, these rulers of a small city in the interior of the Judean mountains were already maintaining sophisticated trade routes that extended hundreds, perhaps thousands of kilometers. They weren't just trading basic products like grains and livestock, but participating in an international market of luxury goods that included precious metals, exotic spices, elaborate textiles, and even precious stones from regions as distant as present-day Afghanistan. The middle class, identified through smaller but nevertheless respectable tombs, consisted mainly of specialized artisans, local merchants, and what we might call a primitive professional class. And here's a detail that will surprise you completely. They had specialized doctors, including primitive dentists. I'm not exaggerating. Several middle-class skeletons were found with clear evidence of sophisticated medical procedures. Precise perforations in infected teeth,
made with bronze drills so small and precise that they rivaled modern medical instruments, broken bones that were repositioned and immobilized with wooden and leather splints. Even evidence of primitive surgeries, including trepanations procedures, where holes were carefully drilled in the skull to relieve intracranial pressure, even more impressive. Many of these patients survived the procedures. The bones show clear signs of healing, indicating that these ancient doctors not only had advanced anatomical knowledge, but also effective techniques for preventing infections and promoting recovery. But what about the working class? Well, here the story becomes dark, and the archaeological discoveries reveal a side of Jebus society that is both fascinating and deeply troubling. Analysis of working-class bones revealed something that should make us pause and reflect on human nature and how certain social injustices seem sadly universal throughout history. The poor of Jebus didn't just live dramatically shorter lives. Life expectancy rarely exceeded 35 years, compared to the 50-60 years of the ruling elite, but also suffered from severe nutritional deficiencies that left permanent and undeniable marks on their skeletons. Signs of rickets caused by vitamin D deficiency were common, indicating that these people spent most of their lives working in enclosed environments, probably in underground workshops or mines. Deformations in leg and spinal bones suggested heavy labor from childhood. Abnormal wear in arm and hand joints pointed to repetitive activities that we would recognize today as repetitive strain injuries. But even more shocking and troubling, incontestable evidence of systematic and organized violence. Many working-class skeletons showed injuries clearly caused by weapons, not accidental injuries, or resulting from occasional fights. We're talking about evidence of organized violence, possibly public executions, or brutal punishments. Precise cut marks in cervical vertebrae, indicating decapitation. Multiple fractures in the skull caused by repeated blows with heavy objects. Broken ribs in a manner that suggests prolonged beatings. And perhaps most troubling, evidence that some of these injuries were inflicted on people who were already tied up or immobilized. This leads us to a conclusion that is simultaneously fascinating from a historical standpoint and deeply troubling from a human perspective. Ancient Jebus wasn't just a stratified society with economic differences, it was a potentially brutal society, where physical violence was systematically used to maintain social hierarchies and control working populations. Even more disturbing, evidence that this violence wasn't just tolerated, but possibly ritualized. Some of the skeletons with fatal injuries were found in positions and locations that suggest their deaths might have been part of public ceremonies or ritual sacrifices. But prepare yourself, because now comes the most impressive and revolutionary discovery of all, a discovery so surprising that it forced archaeologists and historians to completely rewrite their theories about technological development in antiquity. In 2021, during extended excavations at the original site, archaeologists discovered an intact metallurgical workshop that had been sealed by a landslide about 3,800 years ago. When they finally managed to access this preserved space, they found evidence that these ancient inhabitants of Jerusalem possessed metallurgical knowledge that was not only advanced for their time, but in some aspects superior to that of any known contemporary civilization. They weren't just working with bronze, the standard alloy of the era, made from copper and tin, but also mastered a special alloy that included small amounts of arsenic and antimony, creating a metal that was incredibly corrosion-resistant and maintained an extremely sharp edge. Modern metallurgical analyses have shown that this alloy had properties that weren't replicated until the development of special steels in the industrial era. Even more surprising, they knew and used heat treatment techniques that included controlled quenching and tempering, processes that involve precise heating and cooling of metal to alter its crystalline structure and improve its mechanical properties. These techniques weren't rediscovered in Europe until the medieval period, more than 2,000 years later. How was this possible? How did a small town in the Judean mountains develop metallurgical knowledge that was centuries ahead of its time? The answer lies in the elaborate trade routes I mentioned before, but also in something much more fascinating, evidence that Jebus functioned as a sort of ancient research and development technological center. The discovered workshop contained not only production tools, but also what were clearly experimental prototypes, tools and weapons at various stages of development, with incremental modifications and improvements that show a systematic process of technological innovation. Jebus wasn't just a crucial meeting point between the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Anatolia, where knowledge and technology flowed like commodities. It was a place where this knowledge was actively synthesized, experimented with, and improved by local artisans and engineers who were actually pushing the boundaries of what was technologically possible in their time. And now we come to the most fascinating, most complex, and frankly most troubling aspect of life in ancient Jebus, its religious and spiritual practices, which reveal a worldview that is simultaneously sophisticated and brutal, deeply spiritual, and terribly practical. Archaeologists discovered not one but several elaborate underground temples, carved directly into the solid limestone that forms the geological base of Jerusalem. These temples weren't simple worship spaces, they were sophisticated architectural complexes, with multiple chambers connected by tunnels, ventilation systems that allowed incense burning without suffocation, and carefully planned acoustics that dramatically amplified voices and chants. In each of these underground temples, archaeologists found elaborately sculpted sacrifice altars, with precisely carved drainage channels to collect and direct sacrificial blood, ritual cremation chambers, with draft systems that guaranteed complete combustion, and what appear to be preparation areas where animals and other offerings were prepared for sacrifice. But here's what will shock and deeply trouble you: incontestable evidence of regular and systematic human sacrifice. I'm not talking about archaeological speculation based on theories or ambiguous interpretations. I'm talking about incontestable, cold and brutal physical evidence. Skeletons of children and young adults were found in specific ritual chambers, in positions that clearly indicate ceremonial death, precise and consistent injuries that show these deaths followed established ritual procedures. Even more troubling evidence that at least some of these victims were sacrificed alive, in ceremonies that might have lasted hours or even days. Archaeologists also found what appear to be specialized ritual instruments, ceremonial knives with curved blades of specific shapes, bronze cups designed to collect blood, and even what appear to be devices used to immobilize victims during ritual procedures. DNA analysis of some of these human remains revealed something even more troubling. Many of the sacrifice victims were local children, possibly from the community itself. This suggests that human sacrifice wasn't just a practice reserved for captured enemies or slaves, but a regular part of religious life that included members of the society itself. And now we come to the question everyone wants to know, the central question that has obsessed archaeologists and historians: what exactly happened to these people? Why did Jebus, an apparently prosperous, technologically advanced, and culturally sophisticated city, simply disappear from history for centuries? Archaeological evidence points unequivocally to a sudden and violent catastrophe around 1750 BC. Thick layers of ash and burned debris were found throughout the ancient city area, suggesting a massive fire that consumed not only individual buildings but entire neighborhoods of the city. But this wasn't an accidental fire. The physical evidence is unequivocal. Jebus was deliberately destroyed by human force. Archaeologists found hundreds of bronze arrowheads buried in house walls, many still stuck in the charred wood of doors and windows. Weapons of war, swords, spears, battle axes, scattered in the streets and squares of the ancient city, abandoned in positions that suggest intense and prolonged urban combat. Even more troubling, skeletons were found in positions that tell a terrible story of panic and desperate flight. Entire families found in underground tunnels where they tried to hide. Children found clutching clay dolls, adults found with arms protectively extended over the bodies of younger people. Jebus was attacked, besieged, conquered, and systematically destroyed. But by whom, and why? There are three main theories. The first suggests an invasion by nomadic desert tribes, possibly ancestors of the peoples who later became the Israelites. The second theory proposes an internal collapse caused by social revolution. Brutal inequality might have led to a bloody rebellion. The third involves dramatic climate changes that caused severe drought, economic collapse, and conflicts over resources. But the inhabitants of Jebus didn't disappear completely. Modern DNA analysis show that many current Palestinians and Israelis carry genetic markers traceable to these ancient populations. Some cultural traditions that we consider exclusively Jewish, Christian, or Islamic might have roots in the ancient Canaanites. The story of Jebus teaches us that we are part of a much longer and more complex human continuity. Their struggles, successes, and failures are mirrors of our collective journey. The question is no longer what happened to them, but what their experiences teach us about who we are today.